What is happening at Mauna Loa, what we said in our update that went out yesterday, is that we have recognized that the volcano is in a state of unrest. And this is something that the observatory has actually been saying for more than a year now, because we've been seeing slowly increased numbers of earthquakes. We've been seeing a continuous signal of deformation or inflation of the volcano, all of which represents the fact that the shallow reservoirs are being recharged with magma. And these are behaviors that have taken it sort of outside its background level of activity. And if I could just explain what background means, because that's a concept that's somewhat difficult sometimes for people to understand. And I'll tell you that even among scientists, we have some debate about what this means. But background is what we define as sort of the normal, relatively quiet state of a volcano where there are no immediate hazards of concern. So we define that at volcanoes by looking at the long-term record of things like earthquakes and deformation, and look at the numerical values, the long-term trends, and you can essentially establish what does a volcano do when it's not erupting. That doesn't mean it's completely quiet. There will be, especially at a volcano like Kilauea or Mauna Loa, there'll be times of earthquakes and ground deformation, but there's an envelope of what we consider kind of normalcy, where it's not a threat to erupt. So as HVO has been saying, since 2013, and especially since late 2014, we have seen an elevated number of shallow earthquakes at the volcano, and a slightly higher rate of inflation or deformation at the volcano. This has taken it outside its range of background as we define it. We've been discussing this potential change at least since I got here in March, and we've been watching the changes in weekly, daily, monthly earthquake statistics, watching the change in deformation rates at the volcano. I think the key thing is that the unrest or the elevated numbers of earthquakes per day, per week, per month, and the elevated rate of inflation has been persistent enough. There have been periods where it's gotten quiet again, but it's always come back to these elevated levels. We feel that we're outside this long-term background. If you're asking me for specific numbers, I can give you some approximation of what we mean by background and out of background in terms of earthquakes, for instance. Wes compiled these statistics. Currently, we are locating on average about 40 earthquakes per week under the Mauna Loa summit, southwest drift zone, and upper west flank, whereas more than a year ago, that number was about 10 per week. So that gives you a sense of the change in the frequency of earthquakes that have taken us from what we define as background to out of background or a state of unrest. Frank Truesdale, of course, is our geologist and great expert on the eruptive history of Mauna Loa, and looking at the historical pattern of eruptions from that volcano. Since 1843, Mauna Loa has erupted 33 times. They all start in the summit area. And at this point, the inflation center that we're measuring at the volcano is underneath the summit area and the upper southwest drift zone. So it's highly likely that it will start up there in the summit area. So that is the most likely scenario for the beginning of the next eruption. What happens next is what we really can't say with certainty at this point, whether it stays in the summit or whether it jumps to one of the two main rift zones or even the west flank of the volcano. It's true that in 2010-11 we had some new instrumentations installed and improved our ability to detect small earthquakes under the volcano. But even if you look at the record since the installation of new sensors on the volcano, we've seen this uptick in activity. So we can't ascribe all of this to an increased sensitivity of monitoring instrumentation. Mauna Loa erupted fairly quickly in 1975 and 1984 once tremor began. In other words, what we expect to see at Mauna Loa before it erupts is an increase in the number of earthquakes, a startling increase, a strong increase that we recognize. Prior to the 1975 eruption, for instance, there were hundreds of earthquakes per day. We're not seeing anything near that. If we start to see those levels of activity, that would be when we would consider elevating to the next alert level of watch. So if it behaves well, that's what we're going to see. One of the questions we're discussing within the observatory right now is that likely the pattern to occur again? We can't get lulled into thinking that the volcano is going to do the same thing every time. In addition, as our scientists have pointed out, the volcano's been recharging with magma for some time now, for many years. It's possible we're at a very highly pressurized state, and therefore it will not take a long period of earthquake activity, a lot of earth ground breaking to get magma to the surface. So I think in a nutshell what I would like to say is that it's possible the volcano could erupt fairly quickly without days and months of warning. The volcano in Japan erupted primarily because it was a phreatic event. In other words, there was groundwater involved and you had a sudden flash of heated groundwater to steam driving that explosion. That's not what we expect at Mauna Loa at all. For Mauna Loa to erupt, magma is going to have to ascend from the reservoir at about 2 miles, 3 miles depth to the surface. And to do that, it will likely produce lots of earthquakes, something we call volcanic tremor, which is constant vibration of the ground. And we should be able to pick those up with at least hours of warning. What else I would like to say about Mauna Loa is just to reassure people that we are monitoring the volcano around the clock. We have a number of instruments with alarms tacked onto them so that if there's a sudden increase in earthquakes or the appearance of tremor or a sudden tilt excursion, we will be notified in the middle of the night. So we're watching it as closely as we can, and we're confident we'll be able to get word out very quickly should things change.